So thank you everybody for joining this month's webinar on how to find lateral movement with Corelight and the MITRE attacks. So today's speakers is Joseph Gustafsson. Joseph is a system engineer at Corelight Nordics with a background in security critical networks. He helps defender respond to threats by gaining visibility into adversary activity across their on-premise, private, and public cloud environments. You can reach out to Joseph via his LinkedIn profile or the email joseph.gustafsson@corelight.com. Sorry. Joseph, thank you very much for joining, and the stage is all yours.
Thank you so much, Virginie. Thanks for the introduction. And thanks everyone for joining to listen to me talk a little bit about MITRE attack and lateral movement. So let me quickly move into sort of the agenda for the day. So we'll have a quick overview of what is the MITRE attack framework, and also we will look at some tools that can be used to do actual detection of some of the techniques that are covered there. So we'll talk about what is open source Zeek, how does that relate to Corelight, and then we'll dive into some lateral movement examples where we'll use the data that we have from Zeek to find examples of lateral movement in the wild. And we'll leave some time for questions and answers. So as Virginie said, just feel free to post your questions when you have them, and if we don't happen to answer them throughout the presentation, we'll make sure to loop back to them at the end. All right, so let's start diving into it. So MITRE attack. I'm sure some of you have heard about it before. Some of you may not have. And what it is basically a framework for classifying TTPs. So that's attacker tools, techniques, and procedures. And it's more or less a common model and a language to talk around these different attacker behaviors. So that way we can make sure that we have a common terminology, that when I say something like exfiltration over a C2 channel, I mean the same thing that you say when you use the same terminology. And it can be used in a lot of ways to cover a lot of different networks. So we know that a lot of organizations use the MITRE attack matrix in various ways. Anything from having a common frame of reference in the language to how to talk around it, to looking at specific attacks and see which kind of techniques and tactics do they use to achieve their goals, but also from a defensive perspective to look at it and say, what's my coverage? And it's always a topic that I'm a little bit careful when treading around, where it can be incredibly useful to look at it and say, what can my current tools do? Do I have ways to detect different techniques within discovery or defense evasion or initial access? I think it's quite interesting and important to highlight as well that coverage does not equal security. There are ways to be compliant and say, yeah, I have some form of coverage. That does not necessarily mean there's no way for an attacker to get around it. But on the flip side, if I can look at it and say, here's definitely a blind spot, yeah, well, that might be something that warrants looking into deeper. But let's try to break this down a little bit more. So if you look over on the left, you have a blue box there with a couple of different matrices. Because MITRE attack comes in a couple of different flavors, depending on where your environment is located. So which techniques and attacks are relevant might differ if you're looking at an ICS environment, a mobile environment, or like we'll do today, looking at the enterprise environment. That might cover your Windows, your macOS, your Linux, your cloud, your networks, your containers. So that's more or less what you would expect to see within a standard enterprise environment, if you can say that there's such a thing. Another interesting way to look at the MITRE attack matrix here, if we just look at it left to right, that it roughly corresponds to the timeline of an attack. And of course, actual timelines in hours and days may vary wildly, but these are quite often the order where you'll see activities for the simple fact that they are interrelated by how an attacker needs to go about the different activities to reach the goals. The first part would always be reconnaissance, trying to figure out what's the target I'm going to hit. After that, doing some form of resource development to prepare the tools, the infrastructure that's needed to do it. Initial access, coming through the perimeter, gaining a foothold there, evaluating privileges, and then moving through the environment to find the actual targets, because most of the times the first compromised machine might not be the goal that an attacker is going for, whether that's some crown jewels in the form of intellectual property that can be stolen, or some high value systems that can be encrypted for extortion, or some important systems that can be the aim of some destruction efforts. Whatever that happens to be, it's probably not the most exposed system that's the easiest to get access to in the first place, which is why there's a phase of lateral movement between the initial access and the actual collections and exfiltration stages. Another different, interesting way to look at this classification is if we start putting some box here, which tools are good at finding which things here. So if we start with the red box, there's usually a couple of stages or activities within an attack that are more suitably detected from an endpoint perspective. And don't come telling me afterwards, yeah, this specific technique would probably fit another one. Yeah, there are tons of things here that that can be detected in multiple ways, or that might fit in a different category, but sort of roughly around which category of tools would be useful for detecting which kinds or phases of an attack. Some are more lean towards endpoints, some are more lean towards network. And that's basically because of the fact that when you're looking at running code on a system, whether that's for execution, persistence, privilege escalation, when you run code on a system, that's going to be more easily detected by an endpoint solution. When you talk about communication, and that might be, yes, it might be scanning and initial access as well, but it's heavily focused towards lateral movements, command and control, exfiltration, all of these activities or tactics that are by their nature involving some form of communication. And this is where we can often see that the answer to how should I protect my environment isn't one or the other, because they are complementary solutions where a mature SOC probably wants to have both an endpoint perspective and a network perspective, because where one of them shines, the other one has weaknesses, and the other way around. And of course, there's overlap, and of course, there are specifics here that I said that might fit in the other or in neither of these categories. But if we dive a little bit deeper into the network visibility and why that matters, because the MITRE ATT&CK framework is sometimes quite idealistic. These are the things I would like to detect. Well, it doesn't always mean that I can. If we take, for example, IoT, OT devices, I may not even have the ability to run some form of endpoint protection on those systems, because they are delivered as a complete solution from a manufacturer that doesn't really allow me to install third-party code on it. And it may have been old from the first place, or not up to the highest security specifications. And this is where it's really interesting to see that everything touches the network in some sense. And everything will communicate in one way or another. And that's where you'll be able to get a perspective and a visibility into things that might otherwise be dark spots. IoT and OT are really interesting things here. My favorite example of this is always the industrial printer. So the enterprise printer has its most important function, right? That's contacting the vendor to say, I'm out of ink, you need to contact the customer to sell more, which means they're gonna be cloud connected, they're gonna be connected to the local network, they are usually not patched, and we're usually not up to the highest specs to begin with. So what does that mean? That means there's a system that might be visible to an attacker that can get in. Oh, by the way, it usually has a hard drive. that contains a copy of all those documents that you printed because they were too sensitive to email. You will never have an EDR being able to monitor the activities of that system. At this point, we're still talking about the systems that the IT department actually placed in the environment. There will also be a lot of things that the IT department are not aware of are actually there. Well, it might be official policy, and that will be called bring your own device. If you do not have that policy, people will still plug things into the network, and it's called shadow IT instead. These are really things that for almost every environment, there will be some things in there. And gaining a visibility on that depends on having a tool that's capable of grabbing everything, not just a system that you can go out there and say, I want this specifically. And there's also the fact that, okay, what happens when there actually is an attacker environment? Well, if an attacker gets a foothold on a system, probably manage to do some form of privilege escalation, have root access on it, how much do you trust any logs coming out of a system that you know an attacker has root access on? Depends a bit on your threat model, of course, but it's not unheard of that more sophisticated attackers are capable of not only going in and turning off monitoring systems, but going in and modifying outgoing logs. And that's a sort of a true argument for a network where it's a form of monitoring where it's not really possible for an attacker to observe it, see what it does, and modify their behavior accordingly. Because when they don't see what the defender sees, they don't know which things to avoid. They don't know which things are getting caught in that net. All right, enough about why network is important. Let's go into the more specifics of the day. So back to the MITRE ATT&CK matrix. What we're going to focus on today is lateral movement. So going back to sort of the timeline of an attack, here we assume that attackers already in the environment. They've already found a way to penetrate the perimeter in some way. They've established persistence on a system, and now they're going to look for the more valuable things that they can actually use to achieve their goals, whether that's some form of ransomware attack, where they need to find the backups and the important production systems that a victim would actually be willing to pay for, or finding those really important nuggets of data to steal, whatever the overall goal happens to be in this case. So MITRE talks about lateral movements. By the way, they have this numbering system where they number this as the tactic of 0008. And say the lateral movement consists of a technique that adversaries use to enter and control remote systems on a network. Following through on their primary objective often requires exploring the network to find their target and subsequently gaining access to it. All right, so we're fairly clear on what the goal is here for the attacker, but let's play more on the defender side. What can we do to actually go in and start identifying lateral movement techniques and detecting these out in the wild? And here we quite quickly can see a distinction by two different paths we can go down. One of them is the pure detection tools that are available. And this is anything from your IDS, your behavioral-based detections, your machine learning-based detection, whatever method it uses to achieve that goal. It's going to be the tools that raise an alert and says, hey, you have a problem, go look into this. And of course, that means having to place that tool somewhere behind the perimeter. By definition, since we're talking about lateral movement, you cannot depend on your perimeter firewall to do this job. But there's also the other path here, right, of going in and say, let's try to find this activity and data. And this is where we talk more about threat hunting. So looking for the unknown bad things, the things that didn't really trigger something, but there might still be a lot of evidence about it happening. And if you want to go in and find the things that didn't necessarily raise the big red flag, you're gonna need a lot of data. And that data is often quite focused towards the networking side, like we discussed earlier. This is where there will always be evidence of an attack, because all the attacks will touch the network in some way. Even if that's not the initial way of infection, you will still have those command and control channels, those lateral movements, maybe hiding in legitimate traffic, but the evidence is there. And if we have the data, the quite sort of obvious question that becomes, which is going to be the big question for the day, what data? What data do I need to be able to go in and find these things? And that's a nice question, right? So what do I want? Let's take a step back and see, what do I have? Quite a lot of times, this is how it looks like in existing environments, right? There's not one tool, one interface, one place to look for data on what's going on, even if we narrow that down to the network side. There's going to be the SMTP logs, there's going to be some web logs, maybe web proxy, there's going to be the firewall logs. Hopefully collecting some form of flow information from the network infrastructure itself. You got the file transfer logs, the mail logs, the host logs, and this just keeps on going, right? And when it starts looking like the picture on the right here, it's really difficult for a defender to make some form of sense of this and to start seeing the patterns, because the pieces of those patterns may very well be scattered over a number of different tools and interfaces. So what can we do about that? Can we find a way to have a data source and data format that actually encompasses all of these? Well, I'm here for a reason, right? So I'm going to say yes. And this is an age-old question. And the answer turned out to be Zeek. And it's really an age-old question in the sense that it all started over 25 years ago in Berkeley Labs in California, where a gentleman called Vern Paxton was struggling with the same problem, right? I have network traffic. How the heck do I make sense of this from a security perspective? How do I find the relevant pieces of information to be able to pull those out and place them in front of a security analyst? And what he did was he realized there's nothing out there. So he started writing a tool called Bro that later turned into Zeek. And what that is, beyond a network security monitoring tool that's been continuously deployed and battle tested over those 25 years, it's more or less become a gold standard for data format of network security monitoring. So it's an open source project, and it's still being run as an open source project. It's still largely being run by Vern and a couple of his colleagues. He's also running Corelight Labs at the moment, but puts a lot of time into open source research and development in the academic world. And it's been picked up by not only large enterprises, government organizations, but also in SANS training, Cisco certifications, and it's being the gold standard of network data to be ingested by, well, take your pick of CM of choice or other security tools that ingest some form of network information. So it's compatible in a lot of places, partially down to the fact that its open source nature lends it very well to be the fuel going into other systems. And the community is still a very, very important reason of why Zeek actually works, and actually works really well, because there's a lot of contributions from different sources out there. So it's open for anyone to not only improve on the Zeek project itself, but also to write scripts and packages running on top of Zeek. So Zeek contains a complete scripting language that allows you to use different events and actions that happen within it to build more complex behavioral detections, looking at multiple events, piecing this together to find other types of malicious behavior. And here we can see MITRE, for instance, released their bizarre package for detecting a number of things, including lateral movements. We'll look more deeply at this in a moment. We have Salesforce putting into work into the JA3 hashes for self-fingerprinting. We have community IDs to stitch this together to other tools, because you might still have a component of the picture we looked at previously, where you see all this different multitude of tools. And being able to have a data format that's stitchable across those different tools still makes sense, because no one's going to get down to one single tool, let's be honest. So what it really gives defenders is not only metadata logs of every single connection going through the network, but also being able to extract files being seen, carving those straight from the traffic flows that are going on. And here we really have the trifecta of Zeek being able to connect your logs and build scripts on top of that that can pull out the files and questions, which turns this into a very powerful tool that's been adopted by a lot of people. So let's look slightly more at the architecture. How would you actually go about using and deploying Zeek? So starting left from right, there are some form of a data source. And Zeek can ingest any form of network data as long as it's IP based, probably going to be fine. It doesn't really matter if that's coming from a cloud VPC or that's coming from an on-premise packet broker, switch span port, optical tap, whatever that happens to be. Feeding into the open source Zeek monitor. At that point, it can not only analyze the traffic, but also enrich it with a lot of other data sources. Whether that's your threat intel coming from, well, take your pick, or enriching that based on customer data. If you have organizational or network information, you can put that already into Zeek to enrich the logs coming out of it using the input framework there. And this also speaks to the open nature of Zeek, right? Where it really wants to ingest and integrate with whatever you have around it, which is super powerful. And the logs coming out of that will, of course, be the metadata logs that we talked about, and the insights going into, well, your CM of choice or whatever other system. It could be anything from a command line tool where you use Zeek to go in and search for things that are interesting to you, putting into some bigger system to correlate with data from other sources, feeding into machine learning pipelines. After a while, it comes down to what's the use case of great network data? Well, there's a lot of them. Taking the files we talked about before, putting them into whatever sandbox of choice you have for doing both static and dynamic analysis of executable files, or looking into other files going through the network. So that's sort of where Zeek fits into the overall network and security architecture. What is it? Well, what comes out of it is going to be a lot of data, a lot of network logs. And don't bother trying to read the tiny details here. That's not really the point. The point here is that there's going to be a number of logs, either for specific protocols, like your HTTP log, which tries to look at an HTTP flow, go in and pick out the important and the interesting fields there to condense that down to the smallest log possible, still containing the fields that we believe are interesting from a security perspective. And a lot of the work of the past 25 years has been finding that balance. How much data should we throw away to make room for all the logs, and how much data should we keep because it's actually interesting? And then the big kicker comes in of linking all of this together, where I have a unique ID that ties together everything from a single connection to say that not only here's my HTTP parameters, it's also here's my general connection parameters, my SSL parameters, and whatever else might have happened within the flow, whether that triggered some form of Zeek notice, or there is something weird popping up that goes into its own weird log. Maybe there was a file transfer as part of that flow, and that goes into a specific file log. And all of these are connected, which means you're not really looking at a pile of data, you're looking at a web of data, with a very important difference that you can just, if you find a thread, you can start pulling on that, and you'll start uncovering all these things that thing is connected to, which is really interesting from an incident response perspective. So let's take an example. How might this actually look? So at the top here, we have a Zeek log. I know it's a lot of technical details there. We're taking out the timestamps. We have the unique connection identifier that we talked about, the 5 tuples, the actual DNS query that goes out, but not only the query going out, but also the content of the response coming back. And what you can see here is that it's a lot richer than your average DNS server log. A lot of DNS servers log queries going out, not replies coming back. and doesn't really associate that with, well, the rest of the connection data around what was going on at the time. An interesting example where this becomes really, really important was the whole SolarWinds incident. I'm sure most of you are familiar with SolarWinds. And what was interesting to see there, it used a command and control channel over DNS, where commands were encoded in the replies. So no one actually intended to go to one of these IP addresses that you see in the reply. They were just a way to convey information. And most DNS servers would not log that part. But if you have the richer Zeek logs, you can go back 6, 9, 12 months and read the actual command and control traffic that was going a long time before people knew what to look for. I mean, it's easy to gather data when you know what you're looking for, like after the fact that the C2 mechanics of SolarWinds became apparent. So at that point it was easy, but what happened before that? What happened 6 months before that? Because everyone knew that was out in the wild a long time before it became publicly known. All right, so that's sort of what Zeek is about. And let me move on to Corelight. And what Corelight is more or less the custodians of Zeek. Because Zeek at some point turned into a company. Well, sorry, that's actually the wrong way to put it. A company was formed around Zeek. And the way this actually started was that Bern, the gentleman who started writing Zeek in the first place, and after it started to gain a foothold out in the wild, people started calling and saying, hey, this is really cool. Can you support it? And suddenly a consultancy company was born. And after realizing he was spending all his time in the wrong places, figuring out the system administrative problems, the Linux problems of how to run Zeek, not how to run Zeek itself, but how to make it run well on a platform in different places. Okay, let's just solve this once, and then deliver that as a platform, as a product. And suddenly a product company was born that turned into Corelight. And more things have been added over the times, but the core is still the open source Zeek, taking care of that, integrating with the community to the benefit of everyone. So Corelight just raised $150 million in Series E funding from Accel, CrowdStrike, and Cisco. So further proving the point that this is something that's useful for some of the elite defenders out there. The biggest and the best people think that this is the go-to place for network data. And it's deployed in a lot of places, both in enterprise and in government sectors around the world. And whenever CrowdStrike goes out there to do incident response, they bring Corelight along with them. Mandiant likes to use it, both for IR and for managed defense. Microsoft Defender has integrated Zeek into Defender for Endpoint because they were facing the same problem, right? Even if you look at a network card from an endpoint perspective, there's going to be packets going in and out. How do we make sense of those packets? Well, they came to the same conclusion that Zeek is really a good way to do it. And they also contributed to the open source community at this point, contributing Zeek ports to Windows, doing performance optimization that will benefit everyone. And it's really great to see that when even these really big companies contribute to the open source projects instead of just using things for themselves. And we're also in the Black Hat NOC, Splunk, Sponsor the SOC, and a lot of other places. And what we've done is to take the Zeek network security monitoring component and sort of going with the design patterns of elite defenders that we were seeing out there. And the first and obvious thing to do was look at sort of how do people deploy Zeek? Well, they have their open source Zeek cluster. Next to that, we often saw an open source Suricata cluster for intrusion detection systems. And next to that was quite often an open source PCAP solution. And then all of this fed into some form of analytics, whether that's based on machine learning or some other method of doing it. It was usually aggregated somewhere for doing the more advanced analytics that needs multiple data sources or more compute power that you can reasonably do on the network sensor where you're seeing the traffic itself. So this is the same thing that we're trying to see. What can we do when we start running multiple open source softwares next to each other? figuring out that not only is it, doesn't have that big impact on performance, it actually has some really good benefits of doing this in the same place. One of those is if you run Suricata for IDS, you can take the output of Suricata and you can pipe that back into Zeek, which means that this unique ID that we talked about earlier for linking together all your network metadata also covers your intrusion detection rules. Right, and then linking that further with the packet capture means that if a single flow triggers an intrusion alert, that is stitched with the context and actually linked to a specific pre-correlated packet flow, which is kind of cool in my opinion, because that means that it reduces the effort of an analyst trying to go in and start correlating these different systems that we saw earlier, and it's already all there. It's already in the same place, and there's already a lot of analytics that can be run on this as well. From a platform point of view, it looks very similar to what we had before. It's more or less the same architecture. We have data from many sources feeding into sensors. The few components here that were not present in the general Zeek architecture is the packet capture bit. There's also an option to do sort of manage multiple sensors from a single place, and we built an analytics and a tool and a place for an analyst to go in and actually work with the logs, to keep the logs there, to do that triage, aggregation, log storage, etc. That's called Investigator. And I'm not going to go too much deep into this. It's still the same design pattern, still the same enrichment, still the same openness when it comes to rules and how to use the data. Sensors are available in a lot of different form factors, anything from running on a Raspberry Pi to a big data center where you can go up to 100 gigabits on a single 1U sensor, which took some serious engineering effort and hardware acceleration to get it there. Still runs in clouds, in containers, in virtual environments with unified management. So much about Corelight. That's not the goal of talking about today. Let's go back into some examples, because that's what we were promised you at the beginning, right? Let's look at lateral movement. So bring up the attack matrix again. We talked about lateral movement as that tactic. Now we're going to be in a specific technique called lateral tool transfer and have a look at that one. So the assumption at this point is that we have an attacker that's already in the network, that's already inside the perimeter, maybe on an unmonitored device, IoT device. This might be the printer we talked about before. This might be something else. It might be a server that's exposed to the internet. However, that attacker came into the environment in the first place, they're now at the point where they have some tools developed that they need to use, but they need to have them on a different system. So they need to get their exploit kit, their C2 framework, whatever it happens to be, onto the target machine. And what can be done to actually find that activity. So lateral tool transfer is the MITRE ATT&CK technique 1570. And the problem we're looking here is that we have a lot of file transfers going on in a normal enterprise environment, right? And an attacker needs to move this around, and they can, for instance, use some of the already available tools and protocols that are in there. So that might be your SMB, which is a Windows protocol, which is widely used for printers, for file shares, for many things within a Windows environment. So that's a legitimate protocol that you will see if you just turn on some monitoring. FTP is a different example where you go in and you see file transfers either within the same network or some remote hosts. And these might be legit, but it might also be bad stuff in there. In the end, it's going to be a noisy environment. And that's where we need to have some more advanced analytics to go in and see what's actually good and bad here. And this is where I want to jump into the MITRE Bazaar packet. So here we're really leveraging the fact that there's a huge open source community. There's a rich programming and scripting language in Zeek which means that the community out there has developed hundreds of scripts that are open for anyone to use. So Bazaar is actually something called the Bro-Zeek attack-based analytics and reporting package, which is slightly too long to use in common speech. Bazaar probably makes more sense there. And Bazaar is a package that can go in and attack and detect a number of attack tactics and techniques, including lateral movement. So it was initially written by a guy called Mark Fernandez, who works at MITRE, as well as contributing to the open source Zeek development. And I just love seeing this sort of open source community leverage, where a lot of people who use and love Zeek also go in and contribute to the project for the benefit of everyone. And you can find a lot more of those details. You can look at the GitHub page, or just go into YouTube and search for the content there. So let's double click and see what would we actually be seeing by running Bazaar on this type of traffic. And it has a couple of indicators for lateral movement. And if we look at lateral tool transfer in particular here, there's a lot of detection centered around using the admin file shares. That's going to be your admin dollar or your C dollar file shares to find the suspicious transfers over these for these specific shares. And when one of those is triggered, that will generate a Zeek notice. So that's a log that's similar to an alert, but running on Zeek itself. So it doesn't have anything to do with IDS systems or the Suricata we mentioned before, or all this is pure Zeek. And when it goes in and it detects those kind of behaviors, that might be an SMB writes an admin share, or it might be multiple failed attempts going in there. When it sees these attempted lateral movement, it can even carve out a specific file and link that to that flow and say, not only do we have the rich logs, Zeek logs, foundation, everything, we also use the capability of scripting language and the capability of extracting those files, which is something that makes this real good. We use all of those three capabilities of Zeek in one place to help the defenders here. All right. So that's one of the cool things that MITRE Bazaar can do. Going back to the lateral movement examples we have here, and let's take another example as well, right? So we have exploitation of remote services, which is a different technique under the same tactic of lateral movement. So the assumption here is still the same. We have an attacker that has a foothold within the environment, but instead of trying to hide within the noise of a legitimate service and using the fact that legitimate services are open inside the environment, we exploit a vulnerable service to use it in a way that wasn't really allowed or intended. And we'll look at some of the SMB logs again. This time, as we said, we're trying to exploit the remote service to do something it wasn't intended to do. And there are a lot of protocols running in the local environment, and a lot of those can and will have vulnerabilities. So I know this example is slightly old, but it's well published and well known. So let's use Eternal Blue and sort of the entire Eternal class of exploits that were used by WannaCry, NotPetya, and a lot of other attacks. And they caused a lot of problems out there. So they were associated with NSA in the first place, but a lot of others picked them up as well. And they cost over $1 billion of damage worldwide in the first year alone. So this is a big problem, right? And you will find that a lot of things out there are still vulnerable to it. Ideally, there shouldn't be any vulnerable SMB implementations, shouldn't be any SMB v1 running in most places. Yeah, it's still there. And there was actually a Zeek package contest. So this is something that the open source community runs, has been running a few times, where you can actually win cash prizes for writing the best Zeek packages. And the first winner of this was a gentleman called Lexi Brent, who wrote a Zeek package called Eternal Safety that's used to detect malicious SMB v1 traffic. And that's something we'll have a look at now to see how we can use that one to find some of these eternal class of different vulnerabilities and exploits. All right, so let's get our hands dirty a little bit. Let's fire up Metasploit. If you're not familiar with Metasploit, it's a framework used by attackers and red teamers when they go around messing around in an environment. So we just load in our exploit here, which is Eternal Blue in this case. We set it to target a specific remote host, and then we run the exploit. And this is how easy it is. And we're trying to see if we get a connection back from the target in this case. And yeah, this will start flagging up within, well, Splunk in this case. Use whatever thing you like. You can find this on the command line if you prefer to run with only the open source stuff. So here we see that Eternal Safety detected that we have some suspicious traffic. We're using an unimplemented anti-transact rename, which isn't something you should be seeing. And the interesting part here is that we're looking at behaviors rather than specific signatures in some sense here, because there are multiple ways of doing this, right? We can use the Eternal Safety package to detect many of these different Eternal class exploits, but there's also a different package written by MITRE as part of the Bizarre package, which also goes in and detects. And what actually for this traffic, you would see two notices. You would see one from Eternal Safety, you would see a different one from MITRE Bizarre saying that, all right, we have some evidence of execution here, where we have found the service creation portion of the same exploit running in this case. So they go about this slightly differently, but I think it's really interesting to see the power of the scripting language on top of this, how you can take different events, stitch them together, and find these types of attacks. So for the Eternal Safety one, you would have a violation of anti-rename in this case. That would be able to detect not only a lot of different examples within this class of exploits, but also potentially new and novel attempts to exploit the same class of problem here, which is, I think, a really powerful example of what Zeek can do, where you can go in and find unknown bad behavior that you couldn't do in any way with something like a signature-based IDS system, where you always need to know exactly what you're looking for, right? All right, enough about the Eternal exploit. So what we've been talking about so far, just to sort of let me wrap this up a little bit before we go into questions and answers, we were talking about the MITRE ATT&CK framework, how different tools have sort of by their inherent nature different coverage. Some types of malicious behavior and different phases of an attack will be more easily detectable by an endpoint solution, some by a network solution, and some by other forms of defensive technology. For both the network and the endpoint have their own strengths and their own values. A lot of that's around the fact that the endpoint goes really, really deep. Nothing will ever be able to tell you more about what's happening on a specific system than a defensive technology that's designed to run on that specific system itself. However, the network will give you a much wider, broader view, catch those things that happen to either fall between the chairs, or it might run on a system that's not even monitored. These things you don't know are in there, the shadow IT, the IoT, etc. And then using open source Zeek as a way to gather logs, to run scripts, to extract files from all the different kinds of network traffic that we're seeing in the modern environment, and how we as Corelight has leveraged the open source Zeek and stitched that together with different tools using the same design patterns that we've been seeing elite defenders using for the past 20+ years, to put it in front of an analyst in a way that makes sense and that's easy to work with. And then we use the open source Zeek to find a couple of examples of lateral movements here. We looked at lateral tool transfers, we looked at the Eternal Blue and Eternal class of exploits, and how the Eternal Safety package can be used to detect a lot of these, and the MITRE Bizarre package as well. And that was the end of what I intended to talk about right now. Hopefully we have some questions. I see we have about 10 minutes left for questions and answers. Virginie, I don't know if you're still on. I want to
Yes.
moderate the Q&A session here.
Yes, Joseph, thank you very much for your presentation. We do have some questions, and please, you're still able to ask your question via the question box. So the first one would be, what about the fact that more traffic is becoming encrypted? Does it mean that network monitoring will soon no longer work?
All right, it's a great question, and one that pops up quite often, or so the effects of encryption here. And there's a couple of ways that I'd like to look at that one, because it's not a very there are multiple things around it. One of them is, yes, definitely more and more things are getting encrypted, and looking at encrypted traffic, of course, will not show as many things as unencrypted traffic. Because that scrambles all the ones and zeros. The sad fact is that a lot of traffic is still unencrypted, especially if you look inside enterprise environments where you might have sort of going out towards the internet, things get encrypted. On the inside, there will still be a lot of that stuff going there. That said, there are many ways to go around if you want to decrypt. Absolutely, there are a lot of folks out there who like to put a decryption box in front of their solutions and their environments. Now, is that a way that will work for everyone? Probably not, because it has a number of hassles around it when it comes to how to deal with decryption, whether that's from a legal perspective, where in some regions and jurisdictions, you might not be allowed to decrypt banking information, healthcare information, personal information. And that's before we even get into all the technical hassles and sort of working against the stream of technology development, where for every TLS version, for instance, it gets harder and harder to do break and inspect. So what we did, and sort of what's really possible to do within Zeek that's really cool, is to say, you know, we have access to a lot of more information when we're looking at network traffic than just the ones and zeros. Sure, ones and zeros are really cool and contain a lot of information, but you also have the packet sizes, intervals, etc. So starting to look at traffic patterns and starting to look at the unencrypted bits of encrypted flows like handshakes, etc. What we're doing, and where a lot of research is being done right now, is, okay, let's just assume everything gets encrypted, and this is the data we have. What can we do with it? And it turns out we can do a lot with it, because, as I said, there are unencrypted handshakes that contain a lot of information. Attackers like to go the easiest route, just like defenders. So when tools become good enough to force attackers to use actually encrypted C2 channels, etc., well, you see a lot of examples when they do just as bad a job as most other people trying to implement encryption in the first place. It's hard to get it right. We wrote a blog quite recently where we were able to go out and fingerprint a number of malware strains, including Async Rat, Agent Rat, and then a couple other ones, just by how they did their TLS encryption. And at that point, it just becomes a big red flag instead of say, now we can have a much easier way to detect them. But that's not going to work all the time, right? Another way to do that would be to look at the traffic patterns and say, what can we learn about the communication going on inside without doing break and inspect? SSH is a nice example where you have an encrypted command line session. And just by looking at the sizes and intervals of packets, you can start doing inferences and figure out, is this a human on a keyboard? Is this someone using a password-based authentication or a public key-based authentication? Is this someone running a script? Is this someone running file transfer? Is this someone running a tunnel in a tunnel in a tunnel? And when you start linking these together to say that I have an SSH session open on a non-standard port to my web server, through that one, someone set up another tunnel, ran a couple of scripts, and then started transferring out a couple of files from my file server. Yeah, you don't really need to decrypt to say that you have a problem. If you're not able to grab the exact detail of those files from the file server itself, yeah, you might not be able to say exactly the files that went out, although you could probably get that from other sources when you start linking it together. You definitely have a problem, right? So the way I look at encryption, that yeah, it will force us to be a little bit smarter as defenders, but that's about it.
All right. I think I've got two questions within one question, so I'm going to read it slowly. Do we have an idea on the coverage of the MITRE attack using Zeek or Bizarre? Also, are all Bizarre logs tagged with MITRE attack metadata?
So to start, sort of, if we know about the coverage, yes, I didn't want to bring it up here to get a little bit too much corporate sales here. If you go to the Corelight webpage, just Google Corelight MITRE or Corelight MITRE attack, you will see a much more detailed breakdown of what's being covered by different methods, and that's mainly being done by Zeek and Suricata. So that's definitely the way to do it, and most other vendors as well will be very happy to show. If you want to compare, for instance, with CrowdStrike, I know they have great views on how their endpoint covers different parts of the network, and then you can start looking at these two side by side and see that they shine in different areas. So that is how, I don't know if there's a specific one for open source Zeek specifically. That's a good question, but I know there's one for Corelight at least where you can see how we use Zeek to cover MITRE. And if MITRE Bazaar itself tags these specific techniques and tactics into the logs, I'm not 100% sure if they do that problem, to be honest. I'll need to check if they put that into the log, but if you look at the MITRE Bazaar package on the repository, they very clearly tags out the different techniques being used within the description of the package there. I would think they put it in the detections, but don't hold me to that one. I'll need to check that one, see if they're in the log itself.
Okay, we've got the details of the person who has the question, so I'll send it to you. I have another question. How do you recommend working with MITRE attack framework? Does coverage equal security? Yeah,
okay, so that's also very interesting one that pops up quite. I know people use MITRE attack in different ways. I would definitely say that coverage is not the same as security. And I've seen examples where you can have coverage on the entire MITRE attack matrix. That does not necessarily mean that you're actually secure, and there can still be a lot of holes going into it. I see it more as a common reference, as a way to talk about these different things and think about different styles of attacks. I would probably caution about being too prescriptive and going for just hunting for percentage points of coverage. Something that has 92% coverage isn't necessarily making you more secure than something that has 84% coverage, or whatever those coverage points might be. I think you need to go one step deeper to understand how it actually affects what's possible and not in an environment.
All right. Do you want to take one last question before we close the call?
Sure. Let's do one last question.
How does it work with open source? Does Corelight own or control Zeek?
Right. So to be very, very clear, Corelight does not own Zeek. Corelight does not control Zeek. Zeek has its own people deciding where that project goes, and that's nothing that Corelight as a company has anything to do with. Now, what makes it slightly interesting is that there's a lot of overlap. So there's no secret that we spend a lot of, or Corelight spends a lot of research and development money and resources building open source, including contributing to the Zeek project itself. A lot of the core contributors are working for Corelight, but there's a very clear distinction there on what's open source and what's corporate, and where does the jurisdiction, if I can call it that, of the company end. So Zeek will always live its own life. It will always be usable for anyone who wants to, including competitors, and it's being used like that, and we think that's fine. That's the path we decided to go. You can really see a lot of the open source and the academic mentality behind it as well, that good things should be usable by everyone, in the end, that will make us all more secure. So it will always be an open source project. It won't be taken over and steered in a specific direction if that's not in the interest of the people behind the open source project.
Well, that's a nice a way to introduce our last slide for our next webinar, because our next webinar will be getting started with Zeek, and that's going to be presented by Corelight Open Source. So as Joseph mentioned, that's a group that is dedicated to Zeek, and they separate, that's what we say, Corelight Open Source. And it will be presented by Richard Bechtlich, and it's going to be on the 18th of June. So you will get a link to register to our next webinar for June. Thank you very much, Joseph, for your presentation. You and everybody, thank you very much for attending. We'll send you an email with the recording shortly. Thank you and have a lovely day.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.